And when I talk about Sharia, I'm obviously going to be flattening a lot of things and generalizing a lot. So I don't want you to take this as the be-all, end-all explanation of everything. I'm trying to just hit the bases. That said, in its own conception of itself, Islam is a religion which means attaining peace through submission to God, to the will of God, to put yourself into conformity with the rest of the universe. So normally I have a pen when I do this. I don't have a pen, and if I drop my Starbucks thing with water, I'll have to blame Doha. Why are you throwing stuff at me, dude? That's very un-Islamic. So this pen in the Muslim conception is Muslim because it fell. Because it has no choice but to obey physical laws of the universe, God's laws of the universe. Therefore, the only thing in the physical world that doesn't have to obey God's laws in a moral sense is humankind. So humankind is tasked on earth, put on earth, in order to willingly submit to God. Unlike everything else in the world, including animals, for example. And the way in which God communicates this is through revelation. The revelation begins with the first human being, Adam, and his wife, Eve. And there are constant reminders, people who are chosen as prophets, to give the message to humanity, the core of which is always the same. So in the Muslim conception, Abraham, Noah, Moses, David, Solomon, John the Baptist, Jesus, they are all Muslims insofar as they are all preaching essentially the same message. The final messenger is Muhammad, peace be upon him, who lives from 570 AD to 632 AD. That is a huge mental blank in Western history, because in Western history, there's like lots of cool stuff, and then the Roman Empire gets destroyed, and then nothing happens until like 1400, right? So just like 1,000 years, people are just like hanging out, and life stinks until Columbus bumps into America, thinks it's India, calls the people Indians. Do you know, America's really interesting because I go on tangents a lot. I have ADD, so it's not my fault. It's a medical condition. Columbus found this continent, and he spent the rest of his life denying he had found a new continent, right? He died on his deathbed. He was insisting that he had actually found Asia, because everybody wanted to get the spices from Asia, right? So basically, after America was discovered, for like the next 150 years, everybody spent all their time and energy trying to get around it, right? Northwest Passage, going around underneath South America, just trying to get past this huge thing without bothering to figure out what was in it. That has nothing to do with anything. Hopefully all it's done is just confused you. So Muhammad dies in the year 632. The reason this is important is because for Muslims there are two sources of guidance. The first is the Quran, which in the Muslim belief is God's revelation through the Prophet Muhammad to all of humanity. And the second essentially are Muhammad's character, examples, morals, his life circumstances, everything he does and says, approves of, disapproves of. These two things together are Sharia. Sharia literally means in Arabic, the path to the water, right? Because Muhammad is born on the western edge of what is now Saudi Arabia, which is a desert. So water is important, right? Because if you don't have water, you're gonna die. It's important. See, I have a prop too. That was really bad. I have like really bad jokes, it sucks. On the upside, the pen is still on the floor. So it's established that. So Muhammad dies, and when he dies, this is when you have the first crisis of interpretation, right? So for example, let's say everyone in this room, we are the first Muslim community, and we'll pretend that somebody here is the Prophet, peace be upon him. I'm not going to claim that role for anyone. And someone has an argument or a dispute, and they say, what do we do? What's the answer? Exactly, ask Muhammad, say, hey, this guy took my camel, and you're like, no, it was my camel first, or like, your camel doesn't look like that, and whatever, right? There's a dispute, there's a problem, he resolves it. And what he says becomes codified as part of his life lessons. But when he dies, who do you go to? You get what I'm saying? This is where Islamic law is born. In attempting to figure out how to answer questions about how to live as a human being in the world when there is no direct human being able to provide you answers. Who has the right to provide you answers? How do they determine those answers? What force do those answers have over you? And can you, should you, or will you challenge those answers or offer your own? Does that make sense? That's where Sharia comes from. So you have interpretive communities that are born, right? And this takes a couple hundred years, right? Islam is not set in stone when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, dies. these identities, for example, of Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, which are the two major divisions in Islam, these aren't codified or solidified in people's minds until many decades after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has passed away. In this very fertile, tumultuous, confusing time, people are trying to figure out where authority is. And at the same time this is happening, the Muslims have basically been united under, by force in some cases, an Arab leader, one of the Arabs, who is embarking on a program of conquering the world. Now, that doesn't mean that has religious legitimacy, and I will talk about that in more detail. But to give you a sense of how fast things are moving, and this is really important to understand, the Prophet Muhammad dies in the year 632. In the year 643, which is 11 years later, there are Muslims in India, right? If you know maps, and I know in America we don't like geography because it's un-American. That was a joke. It's pretty far, right? In 641, Muslims have entered Egypt. In 711, they have taken Spain. In the 720s, they were in France, right? And by 750, they fought their one major battle with the Chinese somewhere in basically what is now Tibet, and they defeat the Chinese, and most of Central Asia falls under Arab rule. This is all in a period of 120 years. It sets in motion an economic, social, and intellectual renaissance which produces an empire larger than Rome at its height. It produces incredibly wealthy societies and huge urban conglomerations. The capital begins in Damascus and then moves to Baghdad, capital of Iraq, which at its height has well over 1 million people. It's a city so large that they literally have to import thousands of people from surrounding areas just in order to support its urban economy. The reason I'm telling you, the reason this is important, is because in the formative memory of the Muslim world, and I'll talk about what I mean by this, the early period of Islam, even though it has its ugly moments and its controversies and its civil crises, is nevertheless a time period generally of intellectual robustness, wealth, and power. The reason this is important is because the historical trajectory of Islam is different than the historical trajectory of Christianity. The first few hundred years of Christian history are the history of minority communities which are heavily persecuted. And while Muhammad himself and his companions were persecuted, tortured, abused, mocked, executed in some cases, nevertheless, by the end of his life, he basically has the allegiance of all of Arabia, and within 100 years of his death, most of sort of the known classical world from Spain to India is under Muslim rule. And this is important because it's very easy to confuse, I'm thinking of Abraham Lincoln here, it's very easy to confuse worldly success with divine approval. You know what I'm saying? Because if in the first 100 years of your history, you're just kicking butt and taking names, you're going to assume that it's happening because God must love you. And therefore everything you do is sanctioned by God. And so this is a motif that was encouraged by the leadership of the Muslim community, and I mean political leadership, because it was in their interests, right? Because if you want to motivate people to fight for you and to advance your rule and advance your power, what better way than to use arguments based in religion, based in divine power? Does that make sense? You all with me? Now, essentially what happens is, in this first 100 years or so, there begin to be struggles over who has the right to interpret the religion. And in the very early period after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, dies, in that very early period, power religiously is power politically. Does that make sense? The leader of the Muslim community is the leader politically as well as religiously. However, within 30 years is not a long period of time, power is usurped by the old Arab aristocracy that had actually originally opposed Muhammad, who have now sort of conveniently, if you want to put it, converted to Islam. They kind of sensed which way things were going and, got onto the bandwagon and went with it and then took over again. They've usurped power and they force a crisis in the 8th century. Basically the crisis, and this is going to sound really weird and really technical, so please bear with me. Basically the crisis is over this. Is the Quran, God's word, created by God and then given to Muhammad, or is it eternal wisdom that exists alongside God for all time? Now you might ask, why would anyone care? Right? It has nothing to do even with the text of the Quran. You're agreeing on the text. You're just asking, did God create it in time and give it to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or is it eternal? Now, it doesn't sound important, right? It sounds like a really annoying, boring question that people would worry about when they have too much time and money, or they're academics, right? And they think that these things are important, and then 5 people read their books. And nobody hangs out with them on Thursday night. I don't know, I'm not talking about myself. Though when that does happen, it is really sad, so I hope you feel sad for me. The reason it's important is this. If you believe that the Quran existed eternally, then it means that its interpretive power exists outside of time and space. In other words, it means that political authority doesn't necessarily have religious authority. You follow what I'm saying? And essentially, some of the leading scholars of the Quran and of the Islamic texts got into a fight with the leader of the Muslim community. They were imprisoned. There was a brief inquisition. This is the only inquisition in Muslim history until actually very recently. And this lasts about 30 or 40 years as the rulers in Baghdad are trying to enforce a certain reading of Islam, and they fail. They cannot break the scholarly class, and this is where, and this is, again, around the year 800, within 170 years of the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, political authority and religious authority finally and irrevocably diverge. That make sense? Now, essentially what you have is pseudo-secularism. A scholarly class emerges, which is not based on where you were born, your ethnicity, or anything like that. It's open to anyone. And in the first few centuries, there were many women, probably tens of thousands, who qualified as judges and scholars and so on and so forth. It was open to anyone, and these people were generally the most literate people in society. They became judges and governors and so on and so forth. And they worked in tandem with political authorities, but they had a very uneasy relationship. So I'll give you an example. You know what an aphorism is? Right? Like a little saying. It's sometimes you see in professions or guilds or fields of study, a little saying that encapsulates a lot of meaning, like a guiding principle. So in the Muslim religion, you're not supposed to drink alcohol, right? For those of you who go to the Muslim world, you will soon be shocked when you realize that lots of people drink alcohol, right? This is like really traumatizing. Like, oh my God, right? But this does happen. So, newsflash: people are different and do everything everywhere. So for all the Muslims who have sort of like starry-eyed views of the Muslim world, and they go there and they get really traumatized and confused, and like everybody's mean to them, they're like, but I'm like you. And they're like, yeah, I'm still gonna rip you off. Bad experiences, personally. I don't even know what I'm talking about. I'm gonna tell a story of like, I was in Memphis today for the first time in my life, and yeah. So the aphorism, and then I came to Colombia. The aphorism, Muslims aren't supposed to drink alcohol. So this aphorism in the scholarly class says, you would be better to trust a scholar who you see drunk than to trust a scholar you see walking out of a politician's house. Get it? People who have any semblance of closeness to political authority are immediately suspect. It doesn't even say why that dude was in the house, right? This is the fact that he was in there means there's something wrong with this person. There was a lot of tension. And of course, the ruling class would rule in the name of religion, and they would endorse and protect religious institutions. When they conquered some territory, they would build a mosque, and the two sides kind of existed somewhat happily, right? Because each got something out of the other. The reason this is important is because this is basically the system that develops across most of the Muslim world, from West Africa to Indonesia, for hundreds of years. You have a scholarly class interpreting Sharia and handling day-to-day affairs, and they're kind of like community guides. And then you have a political system on top, which sort of exists because they have the armies, but ideologically, because they work with the scholars. The reason this is important is because in the 1700s and 1800s, when colonialism basically takes over most of the Muslim world, this whole system becomes undone. And essentially, if you want to boil it down to something very simple, all the craziness, the violence, the instability, the disagreements that you've seen in the Muslim majority world for the last 100, 150 years come from the breakdown in this consensus and the inability to agree on a system of checks and balances to replace it. It is similar to what happened in Europe in the 1800s, where economic and social conditions were changing rapidly, but the leadership was unable to accommodate those changes or deal with them or accept them or incorporate them at a fast enough pace And so you have this constant feeling of you have these old school aristocracies that are constantly falling behind, and then you have warfare and violence and so on and so forth. And so essentially what has been happening in the Muslim majority world is this kind of instability and disagreement, and I'll talk about that in some detail. But for now, I want to spend a little bit more time on Sharia. Are we good with that kind of overview? I've only got like 2 hours left, so that was a joke. One of you was like, yeah. You're weird, dude. It's okay, I just made up a person. I can do that, right? Because what do you know? It's really funny, actually, when you're in the front of a room. You know how your teachers would always know what you were doing? And you always like, how do they know that? It's like so glaringly obvious, right? Like sometimes you're teaching, and there's like one guy over there, and there's like one girl over there, and they both laugh at the same time, and you didn't say anything like remotely funny, and they're both on their laptops. So it's like very quickly obvious that they're like IMing each other, right? And then like, 2 weeks later, they're sitting next to each other. And then like a month later, they're on opposite ends of the room again. And you're like, ooh, right? And then you make them work together on a project because it's funny. I do that sometimes. Because, like I'm a romantic at heart. So I'm like, work it out, dude. Figure it out. So be a man. So anyway, am I allowed to say that? I don't know. You know when to shut off the camera, right? Good man. It's all good. That doesn't really say anything, does it? So, okay. Any questions on that? Are we good? Yes, question.
This may be the wrong word, but is haditha part of Sharia?
Yes, hadith are part of the sunnah. A hadith is literally an item or report. So it's a recording of something the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said or did. And so it's included in the second word sunnah, which literally means example or practice. Yeah. Okay. So it's one of the sources. That answer?
Yeah, I'm going to have a follow-up at the end then.
Okay, that's cool. Any other questions? Out here? Can I like sneak my head out? Oh, this is kind of creepy. There's like a lot of people over here. How you doing? What's going on? Yeah. Hey, get off your phone, dude. I'm looking at you. So, that was kind of weird.
Just quickly related, what else then besides the hadith are in this?
I mean, I will talk about that in more detail, so I'll get to that, yeah. Any other questions? We all good? All right, cool. I'm now going to try to describe the way Sharia functions a little bit. And when I say this, I want you to keep in mind, again, I'm talking about a religious tradition that develops over countless different places and over a long period of time, so there are disagreements and differences and nuances that I can't convey. And this is the kind of thing that people spend years of their life studying, so I know I'm doing it a huge injustice, so please bear that in mind. Now, essentially Sharia is path to the water. It's how God is telling you to achieve the source of life, salvation, peace, compassion, all the good things in life that you would associate with the imagery of water in the desert. The question becomes, how do you walk that path? How do you live that way? How do you get into harmony with the world around you? And the answer in the simple sense is Islam is the religion, but of course, in a more meaningful sense, it's how do you live as a Muslim, as a follower of Islam. Interpretive communities of scholars, as I mentioned, are basically what happened in answer. Not exclusively, but largely and overwhelmingly, this is the answer that the Muslim community historically produced. It doesn't mean it was religiously mandated, it means this is what happened historically, this is how people tried to live their lives religiously. For those of you who are familiar with the Jewish tradition, Islamic law is very similar to Jewish law. And the rabbinical tradition of halakha, which is basically like Jewish Sharia, of legal argumentation is basically what we're talking about. You're talking about people who have legal discussions with each other, who have close and nuanced reading of text, and who argue back and forth with each other over this. That's the first thing. When someone interprets Sharia, Sharia is, in the Muslim conception, perfect. But in the absence of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, you can never attain a complete understanding of Sharia because there is no final arbiter on issues of dispute. Right? So on the things that sort of everybody agrees on, that's fine, but on issues of difference that are posed, for example, by new circumstances or technology, so on and so forth, I mean, as an example, you could talk about stem cells. Right? I mean, nobody asked the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, what about stem cells? Because nobody knew about them. So on questions like that, in the Muslim view, traditionally, there is no definitive final answer. And so as a result, you got this awesome word, F-I-Q-H, fiqh. I won't say it again because it's not fun to say if you're not used to Arabic. It means deep comprehension. Literally, this is Islamic law. Sharia's revelation And when you interpret it, that's when you produce Islamic law. So when people on the news or in the Muslim world say we should have Sharia, what they're actually saying is we should have a certain interpretation of revelation, and what that interpretation is can be completely different from what someone else in the same room is talking about. It's as if you were to ask a room full of Americans, do you believe in democracy? Hopefully everybody would say yes. And then if you tried to get them to sit down, imagine we just took everyone here and said, would you write a constitution for the United States? Do you think you would all agree? Probably not, right? It would be an interesting exercise, to say the least, if people started talking about the Second Amendment or even the First Amendment, what these things meant. We can see that in the United States. I mean, we have the same text, the Constitution, right? We have a common history, but how we interpret it is radically different. And why we interpret it is often conditioned by the historical circumstances we exist in now. It's very similar in the Islamic tradition. It's as if to say that you have an alphabet, which is composed of things like the Quran and your history, and how you order them together to produce things is how Islamic culture and civilization changes. Now, what happened in the majority school of Islam, the Sunni school of Islam, which is about 80 to 85% of the Muslim world, is scholars coalesced into basically guilds. There are 4 major schools, and these are basically schools that are formed around how you approach revelation. And the only reason I'm telling you this is because this was an answer to a problem. How do you determine legitimacy and authority, right? Anyone can say, I'm a scholar, right? When you were a member of a school, you could travel around the Muslim world, and the amount of mobility that existed in the Muslim world was pretty phenomenal. I mean, it was pretty common to see people move 1,000 or 2,000 miles away to pursue their education because there was a common language and common culture, even though there was not a common political unit. And what happened is, if someone showed up in, let's say, a university and said, oh, I disagree with you, I think it's this, and they would say, who the hell are you? And you're like, oh, I'm from Spain, and you're sitting in India, they're going to be like, well, how do I know you know anything? Your school was kind of like a diploma, right? If you go in for a job and someone asks, how do I know that I can trust you? If you show your diploma from the University of Missouri, right, it demonstrates certain things to people, right? They don't need to know anything about you, but that and your transcript basically tells everyone what you're capable of. Does that make sense? This is where the schools came from. Now, because there was no definitive answer, and this is something that really kind of, I think, blows people's minds, the schools agreed that they were all equal, even when they disagreed. That makes sense? You couldn't reject another scholar's opinion as un-Islamic. You could disagree with it, but you couldn't throw it out of bounds, as long as they came from the same from those schools. So as an example, abortion. There are some Muslim scholars who argue that abortion is conclusively forbidden. And there are others who argue that it's permissible within the first 40 days, and some will argue it's permissible within the first 120 days. Now, all of those opinions are technically Islamic, even though they contradict with each other, because they are all based in certain interpretive methodologies that are recognized as valid. Does that make sense? So it was actually a pretty flexible tradition because it operated independently of politics. It produced and sustained a common Muslim culture across very different parts of the world, and of course there were nuances and differences, but the fact is that you had the sense that you could go from one part of the Muslim world to another and really sense what was going on and understand what was going on, and this produces a common memory, which in the modern age is basically translated nostalgically. When Muslims look at their present-day circumstances, they see generally societies that are underperforming and underwhelming, right, that are poor, and they contrast that with Islamic history, as I was talking about, when you had these societies that were wealthy and powerful and sophisticated, and they wonder what the difference is, and this is where Sharia comes in. Muslims look to Sharia as a means for reviving their circumstances. When you get down to the nitty-gritty and ask them, what do you mean by Sharia, that opens up a whole set of questions and disputes and debates. But it is used nostalgically as a motif, as a theme, to hark back to a golden age, and a means to get back to the golden age. Because we lost Islamic law, because we came under colonialism, we had foreign rule, and so on and so forth, we lost our way, we became poor, we became powerless, we became defeated, and now we need to go back. You see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Very quickly, there's another distinction in Sharia which is really important, and this is really technical, and then I'll stop the boring stuff. Islamic law is divided into 2 spheres. One, for those of you who want to know the Arabic, is called ibadat, worship, like avodah in Hebrew, acts of worship. And the other is mu'amalat, or worldly affairs and matters. acts of worship are basically like sacred law, and acts of worldly affairs are like secular law. But both are considered part of Islamic law, and I'll explain this for a second. And here's the legal principle, and then I promise I won't say anything that's traumatic to you again. If you can determine the legal reasoning behind a judgment in Islamic law, if it is rationalizable, then an act falls under worldly affairs. And the presumption in Islamic law is it is permissible unless definitively proven forbidden in Revelation. If an act falls under worship, then it is not irrational, but it is not rational. It is supra-rational. It is beyond human comprehension. And therefore, any action within worship is considered forbidden unless conclusively proven permissible. I will give you a simple example. In the Muslim tradition, Muslims are supposed to pray 5 times a day. If a scholar attempts to figure out why Muslims pray 5 times a day, there is no strict rational answer. Right? I mean, you could say prayer is good for you, 5 times a day keeps you focused, but you could very easily say, why not 6 times a day? Why not 7 times a day? There is no definitive legal reasoning, and therefore, it is a sacred matter, it is outside the realm of human comprehension, it is an instruction from God, and you do it as an obligation of worship, and that's it. Right? You can't change it unless you can really prove that there's grounds for changing it, which is why in the Muslim tradition you can go to a mosque in Massachusetts or Albania or Australia and you will immediately know what everyone is doing. There's almost no difference, including between Sunni and Shia, in Muslim prayer rituals and worship. They're pretty much the same across the board. For the other stuff, it's the opposite. Almost everything is good unless you can prove it's not allowed. Because it's rationalizable, right? In the Muslim tradition, alcohol is forbidden. Why is it forbidden? Because the most important thing you have, your defining characteristic as a human being, is your rational faculty. And anything that deprives you of your rational faculty is therefore forbidden. Make sense? Yeah? So I'm not going to do that again. I know it's like weird. Yes?
You were talking about it's from Revelation. Does that mean that it's in the Quran? Is that where you're saying that that's coming from?
Yeah, it'll be in the Quran or the prophetic example.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you can find a source text that says you can't do this in the Quran clearly and explicitly, you know, and this is very rigorous. Even if the Quran uses a command form, it doesn't mean you have to do it. Because there's a verse in the Quran that says when you finish your pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, go hunt. And the word hunt is used in command form, right? But it doesn't literally, it's never been taken to mean you literally, after finishing your pilgrimage, have to go hunting, right? There would be like 3 million people trying to hunt in the desert. I mean, as a population control mechanism, it's probably great. But, you know, other than that, it's probably not going to help anyone. You know what I'm saying? So the conditions are very strict. Now, essentially what happened is, under colonial rule and in the process of modernization, the scholarly class was disestablished. Its institutions were bankrupted, its legitimacy was taken from it, and the flexible and more pluralist model was lost, and it was replaced by competing voices. And some of the competing voices, the more extreme voices, insisted on a uniform, singular interpretation of Islamic law, which is actually alien to Islamic history, and has been quite socially disastrous, but it came out of a position of social crisis, if that kind of touches on some of the issues there. Any questions on that? I know I threw a lot out there. No? Nice. We are all specialists in ratiocination. That's what it's called, for those of you who are legal minds. You can hang out with that word. If you use that word in a sentence, you don't have to go to class next week. Your teacher said I could say that. All of your teachers told me. They Facebook friend me and stuff like that. Yes. All right. As a final point, the overwhelming majority of what Islamic law consists of, I mean the majority, by a huge percentage, are personal, ethical, and religious affairs. Charity, prayer, fasting, how to treat people, how to behave with people, so on and so forth. And that's the core of Sharia. Now, in the past, some scholars have attempted to basically ask themselves a question. What's the point of Revelation? Right? Like, why is this coming to us? And the consensus that was reached by Muslim scholars, starting with a Spanish Muslim guy, Spain was majority Muslim for about 400 or 500 years, it was a guy named Shaltabi, for those of you who are interested, who lived in southern Spain, is that Sharia law has 5 objectives. These are the protection and advancement of life, property, intellect, family, and religion. The business of Sharia, the point of Sharia, the role of the scholars, the idea of revelation is to protect and nurture life, property, your intellect, your mental faculties, religion or faith, and family or lineage. Now, that's not too different from life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, or as John Locke put it, life, liberty, and property. But the point is that in the contemporary age, this has really been a very, I don't know how to say it, fertile ground for thinking about what Sharia means in the modern age. Because if that's the point of Sharia, how does that translate into everyday life? How does that affect Muslims in very different circumstances, or who exist as minority communities in very large numbers for the first time in a long time? And that's really where conversations around Sharia are going. And to close, and I know I've thrown a lot out there, so I will leave some time for questions. A lot of people assume that Sharia is draconian, it's authoritarian, it's interested in political power. The majority of Muslim history and the Muslim tradition suggests otherwise. Furthermore, I think if you see what's happening in the Arab world currently, that is not an interpretation of Sharia that most Muslims find compelling. In order to explain this a little bit better, there was a survey done in Egypt recently, which just had a revolution, where about 80% of Egyptians said that they believe that Sharia should be a primary source of legislation. When asked what they thought of the Iranian model, ruled by clerics, 6%, which is probably within the margin of error, thought that was a good idea. Essentially, I think the closest model to what the Muslim world is like is the right in the United States. If you ask many people on the right in the United States if they want the church to be in charge of society, they would say no. But if you ask them, should the president or the leadership be pious, church-going people, they would say yes. And that is probably essentially what most people in the Muslim world think, and that's what they mean when they say they want Sharia and they want democracy. They want democratic institutions and politics within the context of a religious and pious society. And what you've seen in the last 10 or 15 years, and a lot of people have really underestimated this, and now they're kind of catching up with everything that's happening in Egypt and other places, is that there was a brief moment of about 50 or 60 years where people were obsessed with this idea of Islamic State, of politicization of religion, which actually probably has its roots in communism and Marxism. If you read Khomeini, for example, the guy who led the Iranian Islamic Revolution, he was heavily influenced by a lot of left-wing movements and a lot of their ideas around authoritarianism. And essentially, that moment has passed because people have seen that it doesn't really work in the way they thought it would. It tends to harm both religion and the state. Whether that's secular or not, I think is missing the point. There was a Tunisian blogger, a liberal blogger, not like an Islamist or anything, who was on Al Jazeera about 2 or 3 days ago after the Tunisian elections, which were the first free elections in Tunisia's history. And they asked him, who did you vote for? And he said, I voted for one of the left-wing parties. I didn't vote for the Islamist parties. And then the journalist asked him, do you want a secular state? And he said no. He wanted a state that respected all points of view. And what has happened in the Muslim world is that secularism has usually, and this is very different from the Western experience, been the ideology of dictators. More often than not, it's not religion that's enforced at the point of a gun, it's secularism and westernization. So in Ataturk's Turkey, if you dressed traditionally, you could be executed. People were forced to become Western as Ataturk understood it. People were forced to change their alphabet, their script, their weekend. Imagine in the US context if you would go to jail for observing Lent, right? You can imagine sort of the traumatic effect it would have on people. In that context, secularism is seen as another political ideology, just like I think very political Islam is seen as an ideology. And so it's actually really interesting because I think every society comes up with its own solution to how to make democracy and its local characteristics work. And I think in the Muslim world, this transcending the secular Islamist divide is where things are going. And it's hard to tell because it's a very amorphous thing right now. We don't really know what's going to happen. Anything can change. But it indicates that these are not issues that are easily settled and they're not issues that are static. Muslim engagement with Sharia is an ongoing, constant thing. It's not one thing, it's not a frozen thing. It's a thing that's always moving and evolving and developing and responding to people. With that, I will end and then ask for questions since I already see a lot of hands up. Yeah, and then there.
You just mentioned dictators and the secularism of dictators. I've recently noticed like Syria, Egypt, and Iraq, they've kind of been moving towards democracies, or Syria's kind of got stuff going on anyway. And I've heard that like minority Christian groups in those countries have had problems with the transition towards the more democratic society. And I'm wondering, what do you think about that? What are your comments on that?
Sure. I'll take a couple of questions.
Yeah.
I think what I was going to ask is if you had any commentary on the use of Sharia in U.S. Court interpretations, because that's been an issue of controversy, is using Islamic interpretation as a possible measuring stick for American courtrooms, and what that can mean. What do you think of that?
Sure.
Maybe this is going backwards, but I would like you to maybe give an example or explain what this coexistence back at the beginning looked like between the political authority and the religious scholars. Because if that's the model that people are looking back toward, what did that look like in practice in terms of, the everyday working of the law and how it was enforced and things like that?
Any other questions? Yeah, in the back.
What's the role of a caliphate?
Oh man, caliphate. I was laughing. I'm not laughing at your questions. I'm laughing at the fact that I'm like drinking out of a straw. I feel like a 5-year-old. It's like a little juice box or something. It's kind of cool. Not that I'm offended at your drink. It's awesome, dude. It's easy to handle, and I love you, man. Nothing but love, dude. All right. One other question. Yeah, right here.
I want to know, back to her question, why is there a movement towards Sharia law in the Western world right now? As in, why do Muslims or others feel that there's a need to implement it or embed it into the existing law of the country?
Okay, these are all really good questions, and they all go in different directions, and I could talk for like 20 minutes on each one, so, Bismillah. Minority rights. Not just people of the book. Yeah, democracy is always scary for minorities. Because if you're a permanently minority, what guarantee do you have that your rights will be respected? That's a danger. Generally, in Muslim history, Muslim societies were more tolerant of minorities. They were not egalitarian, liberal, civic democracies. I'm not making that argument at all. But for example, there were no Muslim communities in Europe outside of Muslim rule because practicing Islam was illegal. As for many centuries in many places, practicing Judaism was illegal. So as Sharia evolved, for example, it tended to be very harsh towards rule by non-Muslims early on, because the fear was that if you didn't live under Muslim rule as a Muslim, you would not be able to practice Islam. And historically, this happened in many Muslim communities. I mean, Spain, one of the world's first ethnic cleansing was of the Jewish and Muslim communities of Spain. Some 10, 20, 30% of the population was pushed out. That said, when people talk about Sharia and Islamic law in the Muslim world, of course, if you're a minority, you're going to think not of the more positive examples, but of the more negative examples like Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. As such, one of the lessons that some of the Islamist parties have learned, and whether you want to interpret this as really cynical political maneuvering or intelligent adaptation is entirely, I guess, up to someone's interpretation, but a lot of Islamic parties realized in the last 10 to 15 years that they would never be able to challenge authoritarianism because not everyone agreed on political Islam. What people agreed on was democracy. They didn't agree on secularism, they didn't agree on Islamism. All they agreed on was they wanted to alternate power and get rid of the dictators. So a lot of Islamic parties have said that they are now interested in elections and democracy. Of course, people question that because they look at other places in the region, such as Iran, where a faction of a very radical Islamic movement took power and controlled the state completely, and then just kind of expelled anyone who intellectually disagreed. So I think there are legitimate reasons for minorities to be afraid at some level, because in a situation of instability, you're sort of defenseless. That said, it's hard to see how a situation of ongoing authoritarianism would be to their benefit, because authoritarianism itself produces radicalism, right? Like we said, the 15 of the 19 hijackers are from Saudi Arabia, right, which is a U.S. ally, right? They didn't come from Iran. And that's sort of the irony of it, is that, when authoritarianism is supported, whoever is supporting it ends up becoming the target of radicalization. That's not to justify radicalization, it's simply how those things work. I don't know if that gets to your question, but yeah, I mean, it's a tough one. I mean, I think with each country there's specificities. The second question I'm going to tackle is caliphate. A caliph is literally in Arabic a successor. When Muhammad was in charge of the Muslim community, he wasn't a political leader. That doesn't mean he didn't have political authority. He was a charismatic leader. Does that make sense? People didn't follow him because he was elected. People followed him because they believed genuinely and passionately that he was the final messenger of God. And they had a religious obligation which extended to many elements of their life to follow this man. Now, when Muhammad, peace be upon him, dies, the question becomes what happens to the community? And it's very important to realize that the context in which Islam is born is of a very tribal and violent society, right? You didn't have any social protections if you weren't an elite male from the right kind of tribe. So the Muslim community had basically constructed a tribal confederation which created social and legal obligations to everyone else. See what I'm saying? Regardless of what their origin was, and created legal protections for the first time. So, for example, in the society Muhammad was born in, excess female children were just buried alive. They were not really considered human. Women could be married and divorced at will. Muhammad, peace be upon him, gave them the right to divorce, to the right to own property, to establish a business, to enter into legal contracts. The first Muslim was actually a woman, his wife. So the shift is remarkable, and for a lot of Muslims, protecting that sense of community was vital. And so they created basically a position called in Arabic Khalifat Rasulullah, the successor to the Prophet of God, a caliph, Khalifa, caliph. Essentially, this position had actual power over the Muslim community for maybe 30 years. Then it was usurped by a dynasty which claimed to be caliph. That dynasty ruled over a single Muslim sort of empire where mostly all Muslims lived, and it was not majority Muslim, but where all Muslims lived within its boundaries for about another 100 years. And then it fragmented and it never got back together again. The idea of a caliph was really revived in the 1800s when, and this is important to understand, like every single Muslim territory was coming under violent colonization. And in this situation, people began to dream of some form of unity that could resist this kind of colonization. And this is where the idea of the caliphate was revived. And so, the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I was seen as opening the door to European colonization of the Middle East. And people therefore looked for a mechanism to stop it. It's important to recognize that people have transnational identities, right? You can be Egyptian and still feel strongly Arab nationalist, or you can be Iranian and feel strongly about the rest of the Muslim world, and this translates itself in different ways. But I think ultimately the Caliphate movement was not very different from Pan-Slavism, or even the idea of European unity, of creating some sort of form of unity. And there are different forms of it. I mean, there's some models and radical groups that literally just want a draconian authoritarian empire with a caliph at top, and then there are Muslim thinkers who proposed essentially a Muslim League of Nations where elected democratic governments would willingly affiliate with each other in some sort of long-term project of unity. So there's a lot of diversity on what it would even mean to have a caliph or if it's relevant, but it comes out of a feeling of political vacuum. I don't know if does that get to your question? Cool. Sharia compliance, Sharia movement, so on and so forth. I think if you asked most Muslims in the United States what Sharia was, they would have no idea. I'm not dissing Muslims, I'm just saying it's a fact. If you asked them what school of thought they belong to, they probably would have no idea. Probably 10 to 15% of Muslims go to mosques in the United States. Many of them, even if religious, are completely uninterested in attending mosques. That doesn't mean they're against the religion, it means that they're alienated from their communities. I'm not saying it for any ideological reason, I'm saying it's a reality that the Muslim community has to wake up to. That said, most Muslims don't care about Sharia in the sense of a political agenda. What they care about when they talk about Sharia is following their religion. So, for example, when I pray tonight, I am following Sharia. Sharia law already exists in the United States, insofar as it is a religious law. Now, the question of whether religious law should become political law is a completely different question, and I would argue there's no grounds for it. But I don't think Sharia is, for the vast majority of Muslims in the United States, any different than compliance to Jewish laws is for the Jewish community. So I think that essentially that's what it is for most people. Now, of course, there are some groups and populations that want something else, but they tend to be minorities, and they tend not to really be very popular. The reason they make more noise is, one, because those are the people the media pays attention to. Two, because if you're annoying and loud, right, you kind of occupy the conversation. And the final reason is because American Muslims tend to suffer a crisis of authority. So what that means is they may genuinely feel attached to the faith, but may not be able to defend their faith. You know what I'm saying? Like, they believe in it, but if someone comes, throwing verses at the Quran from them, verses from the Quran at them, they won't know how to respond to that because they're not religiously literate. So in that situation, they often just become intimidated and don't say anything. There are not a sufficient number of people who are versed in the Islamic tradition who represent the Muslim community in an organic way, who can articulate what people are really feeling. I don't know if that really answers the question. To the question of courts and Sharia compliance, the only area really where Sharia has ever really come up is in Islamic finance, which is a whole other can of worms. And you know what, let me save that and see if there's any other questions, then I can come back to that. Is that cool? I forgot who asked that. Was that you? Yeah. I will save that because that's a big one. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I was wondering about clearing up, that pen example and animals, the instinct, and all that, the unique quality of humans being this freedom of conscience. And you don't drink because that hinders what makes you human. So what is the origin of, or the distortion of, for example, the Iranian apostasy laws, for example, that pastor who, because his ancestors were Muslim, he's convicted of apostasy, or any of the Baha'is?
Sure.
What's the origin of that?
I'll get to that, sure. That's a good one. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I understand that clerics often interpret Sharia. How do interpretive communities vary around the world?
These questions are like really good. I'm scared. I need another juice box, dude. Yeah.
Well, you didn't answer my first question, so maybe you'll answer my second question. About
That wasn't deliberate.
going back to when I asked about hadith, I read a couple of books on Islam this summer, and one of them was trying to argue that there's a lot within the hadith that is contradictory to what's in the Quran, especially dealing with issues of women, because the companions of the Prophet didn't like the revelation in the Quran about equality for women and things like that. And so what happens when part of the Sunnah, I guess, contradicts the Quran, or
Sure, I'll take one more. That's an intense one. People are running away because it's scary. It's okay. I forgive you. You want a juice box? Any other questions? We're good? Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about what you were saying about the political, in the beginning, the political Islam and the religious sort of Islam, where it's headed?
Sure. So, one of the, to your question, and it's a huge question, so I don't want to do it an injustice, but there's a lot of questions, so I will try to get to the heart of it. The Quran is a word I read by a Muslim scholar from England, T.J. Winter. It's xenophilic. It loves other cultures instead of xenophobic. So Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the Muslim community exist in a society that is, generally called pagan Arab, right? It's a sort of a polytheistic, traditionalist Arab society which believes in multiple deities. There are small Jewish communities, a minority of individual Christians, but overwhelmingly, it's not an Abrahamic society. And yet, if you read the Quran, one of the things you're struck by is that the Quran spends almost all of its time talking about Judaism and Christianity. The prophet who is mentioned most by name in the Quran is Moses, like 150 times, followed by Abraham, followed by Jesus, and Muhammad is mentioned 4 times by name. The Quran talks at length about the children of Israel, about the prophets of Israel, about Jesus, about Abraham, and these are sort of the main themes. The only contiguous narrative, the only straight story in a single chapter of the Quran, told from beginning to end, is the story of Joseph, the son of Jacob. in the Quran. So this emphasis is interesting because when Muslims first encountered communities that were not Abrahamic outside of the Arab context, they became confused. What was the context of these communities? What was their status, shall we say, morally, spiritually, religiously, legally, because they weren't Abrahamic, apparently. And basically you had two responses that came up, and there's been a constant tussle between them. One response was that